Okay, let's continue on with sort of this whole colonial impacts for the West Asia region. When you're looking at this particular area, this whole area, North Africa, what's usually and also what's usually called the Middle East. I mentioned last time that you have external forces have been hugely important in this region, and that really explains the region as we see it today and a lot of the turmoil that occurs there. This particular region is the fighting ground, if you would, in sort of early historic period between the Roman Empire in the West and various forms of sort of a semi-nomadic empire in the East, the Medes, Persians, Sassanids, I can't remember the name of some of the other empires. So you have basically what were oftentimes what would now be called the Middle East. And in fact, maybe that's where the word originally comes from. These empires usually coming out of sort of the Persia region and then competing with empires basically basically in the Mediterranean, in the Western Mediterranean. And so the Middle East region ends up as the point of conflict. In this particular area, North Africa is almost always within, some version of the Roman Empire. And so you might say that the areas that are actually touched by the water of the Mediterranean are usually parts of the Western European political system. This starts to collapse when the Roman Empire falls apart. You get nomadic populations moving around, new groups moving in, all throughout this region, whether it be Europe or Middle East or whatever. And there's sort of a vacuum. And what happens is most of the stuff sort of fragments. The Western Roman Empire gets replaced by the Byzantine, if you remember your world history, but they never really have control over this area to the same extent, and really do treat it as a colonial enterprise. They just basically just exploit the crap out of it. And so their center of power is they lose the idea of empire in the sort of Roman sense where you sort of bring things in, and they just become a incredibly exploitive system. And increasingly, for some reason, you'd have to ask Mitch or someone, in the Byzantine Empire, what you get is the role of religion becomes ever increasingly important. And so a lot of this particular region, whether it be the Middle East or North Africa, were actually Christian, but they weren't the types of Christians that were running Constantinople. So in much of this region, you end up with huge riots, famous riots in Alexandria, for example. They were basically religious riots, where what you get is the increasingly conservative, sort of Greek Orthodox, Byzantine Empire groups start hunting down anyone who's any different, religiously, philosophically, whatever, and just sort of, stringing them up. And so the empire actually starts to totally implode because of religious stress, the increasing intolerance of the Greek Orthodox, and to a lesser, and even also further west of the Catholics, for any sort of, religious dialogue. And there's something occurs, and there's some actual conferences where they actually decide what's legitimate Christianity, and a lot of these groups get chucked out like the Arians. And so what you get in this, you have this going on. Now, in this same period, let me switch images here. In the same period, which you then have also is a new religion popping up, and that new religion is actually from this region, and that's an important thing to remember. Because one of the ironies is that, this intolerance that's generated basically here in Constantinople and in the Byzantine Empire, which was pretty much this, was actually based ironically on a religion. Of course, Christianity is based here, and it's based on Judaism, which is based here. And what you find is the third of these religions, which actually starts up in the Byzantine period, is Islam, and that starts slightly further south. But of course, it sees its basis, Judaism and Christianity. It sees itself as basically the new and improved version of the two earlier religions. And one of the logics for Islam, and one of the reasons it sort of makes sense in this region at this time, is that its basic argument was that the Judaism and the Christianity that was proposed in books and been preached by Jesus and stuff like that, there was very little of it that you could actually see in the way the Byzantine Empire operated, even though it said it was Christian. So what they were saying is sort of these guys do do what we say versus do what we do, and they were sort of like, well, you gotta walk the walk. If you're gonna say that you are something, then you've actually got to do it. And so Islam is a religious reaction to the excesses and the sort of screw ups that were happening here. And it just takes off like wildfire. And what happens very quickly is Islam becomes this new religion, moves very quickly through this area, sweeps across this northern section of Africa, basically through the Saharan region over here, and then quickly starts to move to the north. Now, this is a different center of energy because basically, prior to this, your center of energy had been up here. With Islam, the center of energy is basically the North Africa and what you might call the southern part of what we now consider the Middle East becomes your center of energy. And very quickly, this becomes a religious tussle between first the Byzantines, i.e. Christianity and Islam. And of course, as far as Islam sees itself, it sees itself as sort of like a new, revised, better version of Christianity. And then later, when these guys sort of get stomped out, then what you have is, of course, then you have your Christians, i.e. the Catholics further west, to get involved, and that's the whole crusade thing. So what happens is originally your center of emphasis is here, and it's not a religious discussion per se. When Islam starts up, then this suddenly changes completely, and then it becomes almost a religious discussion only. And when the dust starts to settle finally, the Byzantine Empire is gone. It's replaced by the Turkish Ottoman Empire, which basically controls this whole region, which is based in Islam. And this is where you get the term that's still used as a political football by various leaders in this particular region. And that's what they would do, is they would argue that they were defenders of the faith. Because you have to remember that Islam is not a state-based religion, and it's not a coherent religion. It does not have a hierarchy, for example. There's no one that can basically say with authority, this is what we believe in Islam, and this is what we don't believe. Because each mosque and each imam or each religious teacher can do their own version and put their own spin on stuff. And so every congregation is just a reflection of the imam or the if you would, the preacher, if you want to put it in a Western context, and who they follow. But there's no pope, there's no hierarchy. There is an agreement, and again, this has to go back to this idea of sort of competing with the Byzantines. In Islam, one of the things that Muhammad sets up is that you have to understand Islam by reading it in its original form in Arabic. Now, this was already becoming a huge issue in the Greek Orthodox and Catholic traditions. Was, what language is it in? The Latin is the Catholic version. Of course, that's not the language it was originally written in. It was originally written in Hebrew. And in the Greek Orthodox, it becomes sort of the same thing. Then it becomes a version of Greek. And so they're taking the Holy Book, the Bible, and they're translating it. One of the interesting things that early Islam says you can't do that. The words that were given by Allah, given by God to Muhammad, were spoken in a particular way that Muhammad can understand. And you have to keep those words the way that they were told to him. And so what happens is, one of the huge forces of Islam, I don't think people really realize, is if you're Muslim, you have to learn Arabic. Because you can only pray in Arabic. You can only read the Quran, which is their version, their upgraded version of the Bible, if you would, in Arabic. So that acts as a huge unifying force in this region where, God knows how many different languages you had, probably hundreds. There was probably some tradition of people having spoke Latin, for example, since this used to be the Roman Empire, but it had long since disappeared by now. And so what happens is when Islam starts up here, one of its basic premises is that everyone who's Muslim can communicate with everyone else who's Muslim, because one, they have to read and speak Arabic. Two, if they bump into someone else, they know they do the same thing. So the huge majority of this population, they become bilingual. You have to remember, for almost all this region, with the exception of down here, Arabic is not their language, in the sense that it's not their indigenous language. So if you're Egyptian, you speak Coptic Egyptian. So you learn Arabic on top of that, but your home language is different. So the vast majority of this region ends up being bilingual, but this second language becomes a unifying language. It's not only a unifier of religion and faith, it's also a unifier in terms of communication. And so this becomes one of the great powers of the Ottoman Empire, is that they're based here in Turkey. They basically replaced the Byzantine Empire. But they're much more of a unifying force than the Byzantines had been, simply because they reflect a single language, shared, what we often call lingua franca type structure. Having said that, because there isn't any centralized authority, so for example, the Ottoman Emperor called himself the defender of the faith, which isn't the same as being a pope or even say the Holy Roman Emperor or something that you'd see in Europe. Basically, he's supposed to protect Islam, but notice how it's very vague, just exactly what Islam is, because every mosque or church, I want to call it that, and it's preachers. And most mosques, like the Blue Mosque in Istanbul, which used to be Constantinople, I think has 12 or 14 imams. Anyone can be an imam as long as they've gone to Mecca. And then they just basically sit down in whatever is their mosque and they start talking about what they think the religion leans. And if people like what they got to say, they build up a congregation and become more powerful. But they don't speak for Islam. They don't even speak necessarily for the mosque. They just speak for their followers. And so, as on one hand, Islam is a very unified religion, and that you have to learn the same language. You have to, pretty much learn the words in the same way. You have to basically pray in the same language. You can buy translations of the Quran, but they're not. You can't pray in the theological argument of Islam. You cannot read the Quran for purpose unless it's in Arabic, and you can't pray in anything other than Arabic. So, on one hand, it's a unifying force. But the fact that you don't have a unified religious theological system that everyone can interpret any phrase, the way they want, and individual imams will have their own followers. I mean, it's incredibly fragmenting for us. This is why you find a huge number of wars even still going on today throughout this region, all between Muslim followers. But they don't agree on what type of Islam they follow. And this starts right almost from the founding day of Islam, with the initial Sunni and Shiite factions, which, for example, are a large part of the war between Iraq and Iran, and also the civil wars in Iraq, and also the civil wars in Syria. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. So in that context, what you have is the Ottoman Empire is on one hand a unified force politically, basically everything from half of Iran all the way over to the Sahara, and all the way up through most of what's now southern Europe. Becomes part of their empire, including Greece. But then the problem is they're not really, they don't act in a unifying sort of unitary force. And so what happens is when the Europeans become dominant in the 18th and especially the 19th century, especially 1918, the Ottoman Empire collapses. What you have is that all these areas sort of spin off, very much again like these areas had when the Soviet Union collapses in '89. And so what happens is this particular region makes it very vulnerable, because in the process of the 100 years prior to that, for example, the French had taken over almost all this area of Western North Africa. The Italians take over this area that's basically the central area of North Africa. The British take over this area. The Germans get their feet involved in here somewhere. The British and the French both fiddle around with here, and especially post World War I, everyone and his brother, starts, especially the British and the French start putting dibs in this area. And one of the complicated side effects is that when you look at these national boundaries, they do not reflect ethnic groups. They do not even reflect history. They just reflect where the British and French sphere of influence basically said, well, this is where the line's going to be because, this is the British part and that's the French part, for example. And so in that context, that becomes the paradox of North, or what you might call West Asia, this whole area of North Africa and the Middle East. It's incredibly fragmented because none of these areas reflect the actual populations that live in them, the boundaries of state, the country of Syria, the country of Lebanon, don't reflect anything in terms of a unifying factor. Syria's civil war is a classic case in point. A large chunk of the population of Syria is not the ethnic group that backs the President Abad. But in this sort of idea of ethnic cleansing and all the rest of the stuff that you hear talked about in Europe, you actually play that out in this area. So, if some group says they're not a part of you and they don't accept it, then fine, you just try to kill them. And if not, then you shove them out, which is why Turkey has this huge number of refugees from groups that are actually either linguistically, ethnically, or religiously, or any combination of the three, tied to the Turkic populations on the Turkish border, which again is a border based on arbitrary lines. Suddenly the population up here, ends up here because of the guys down here basically saying, we don't want you in our country anymore. So this our country thing is responsible for a huge part of the violence that you see in this particular region. And this region is violent. Now, as I mentioned before, you also end up with the complications that the resources which used to be in the north, and were largely based on trade and sort of economic systems, by the 19th century and 20th century become involved in physical location of resources. And of course, the main ones would be oil. But of course, the other one would be the canal, the Suez Canal here in Egypt. A huge part of the world's shipping goes through that particular canal here, and that generates an enormous amount of revenue for the country of Egypt. You might remember, I think it was a year or two ago, a ship got stuck in there, and all of a sudden, world travel just sort of came to a screeching halt because it's like having an accident on the freeway. So if you're one of the countries that wins, UAE, to a certain extent, southern Iraq, to a little extent, Iran, certainly Saudi Arabia, Dubai, you've got oil. And if you've got oil, then basically everyone's your friend. And if you want something, you just sort of say, hey, I'd like this. And all of a sudden someone will say, hey, for some oil, I'll give you this. And so all of a sudden you're players. But also what that also means is your traditional countries that were basic sources of culture, whatever, and also political power, especially Iran, left out in the cold. And they don't like that. And so this is one of the reasons when you look in this region, it gets very confusing because you'll find countries getting involved in what's going on in other countries. And it's sort of like, well, why do you care? If you're Iran, why do you really care what happens in Syria? You don't even share a border. You've got Iraq in between. Well, as far as Iran's concerned, everything in this region, which used to be part of the Persian Empire 2,000 years ago, is still part of their kuleana. And therefore, they should have a say, and the folks in the rest of this region should listen to them. So they and the Saudis, for example, would shoot each other on sight because Saudi Arabia is the new money. They're, if you will, the oil-rich country. And they see themselves as new defenders of the faith in the 21st century. And so their attitude is like, well, everyone should listen to us. And Iran's like, well, no, we've always been in charge. You should listen to us. And that means if you're Yemen or any place else, you're sort of stuck between these different forces arguing, on one hand, history. In the case of Saudi Arabia, their of course, Trump card to the whole thing is they control Mecca. And so because they control the holy city of Islam, that gives them some at least partial legitimacy in terms of being the protectors of the faith of Islam, which is a very geographically based religion. And Iran, of course, hates that. So this region is a bunch of people that don't like each other. They don't like each other based on history. They don't like each other because they share a religion, but they disagree in the interpretations, which sort of which we receive, for example, in Ireland with Catholics and Protestants. But here it's a lot more violent, a lot more spectacular. And that's why when anyone talks about, reducing the violence in this region, it's very difficult because almost in any situation where you want to reduce the violence, it's in someone else's vested interest to not have that happen. And this is why, for example, in Yemen, Oman, Syria, Lebanon, you just see these persistent patterns of violence because there's, for any three groups that say it's a good idea to have less violence, there'll be a fourth group which actually wants more violence. So you can't get any collective agreement on how to live with each other because at some point or another, there's some group or groups that want you gone. If you're somewhere else on planet Earth, then they might leave you alone. But as long as you're parked in their backyard or you're next door, then they're going to get rid of you or get you to leave. And that's a reaction, one of just sort of the complexity of the region, ethnically, religiously, etc. But it's also a reflection of the fact that these country boundaries were generated by folks living in Paris or in London who didn't give a rat's ass about what was going on over here. And then when these places become countries, whoever ends up in charge of Iraq or Syria or Saudi Arabia, Saudis, for example, they keep those boundaries and those boundaries become, quote, real, unquote, even though they're entirely artificial. And that becomes the huge source of this fragmentation for the region. Now, hang on a second, let me switch out here. Okay, now to add even more confusion to this whole situation, and again, it gives a really good sense of how the Europeans really saw, especially the North Africa, Middle East, same diff, as almost like the back and beyond. It was an area that you could do things in or make things happen, and there were going to be no consequences to you, which was really dumb in hindsight, but at the time is how they thought. The period between 1850 and 1945 is a period in which there's really increasing segregation and in many cases intentional violence against Jews. this entire region. And you have to remember that a lot of this was in countries which were making noises about being more cosmopolitan. France was most famous in terms of the anti-Jewish movements in the turn of the century. And so what you have is this goes on, it persists, it gets ever larger. Post-World War I nationalism makes this even larger. And of course, this becomes most spectacular the National Socialist Party or the Nazis in Germany. But it also ties into other groups. You have to remember that the National Socialist Party's strongest supporters were actually Sweden, which actually had almost a majority of what I suppose you'd call Swedish Nazis. They just stayed out of World War II, but nonetheless they had the same attitude. The British Nazi Party was one of the larger political entities in England. In France, they were a big force because basically one of the themes of the Nazi Party very quickly became the idea that the Jews were responsible for everything. And therefore, blaming the Jews was a good political move because no one would ever stand up for them. And so what happens, of course, is it becomes genocide in World War II. Now, World War II ends, and there's all this horror about what happened to the Jews, and it's such a bad thing, and everyone's feeling really bad about it. And if you're the guys that won, if you're the Allied side in World War II, if you're the British, the French, etc., you've got a huge amount of guilt because, of course, you were actually a big part of the problem. You were also actively involved in segregating against the Jewish population, trying to get them to leave, etc. And so when World War II is done, there's sort of this problem that everyone's trying to figure out, what are you going to do with the Jews? If you leave them in Europe, there's an attitude that somehow you're going to end up with a replay of World War II, because in part, even though it's hard to argue it was their fault, they're nonetheless an identifiable, visible group. There's still a lot of dislike of them. So therefore, if they stay in place, things will just happen again. Back in the early part of the 20th century, when the British controlled the whole area of basically the Middle East, the Western region, which used to be called Palestine, there was a movement by Jewish nationalists to basically move the Jewish population to Palestine and reestablish a Jewish state. This didn't gain any traction pre-World War II. Because, of course, the vast majority of the population was Jewish, might have ideological roots in West Asia, the Middle East. They might even, to a certain extent, have ethnic roots at some point. But the huge majority of them were from Europe. They'd been in Europe for 1,000, 1,500 years. And so they really didn't have any sort of land ties to the Middle East. And of course, you had a huge population already living in the Middle East, who had, whether they'd stayed or whatever, they were there and had been there for thousands of years under the Ottoman Empire. And so what happens is the British are sort of like, why would we let a bunch of Europeans move into a crowded area of the world? Who's gonna decide who belongs with what property? You've already got people living there. It'd be like suddenly moving a group of folks out to, Hawaii Kai. Whose houses are they going to take over? Why should they take over those houses? There's people living in the houses. What are you going to do for the people who are dispossessed? It was just a total zone. They just, no one wanted to deal with it. So what happened is post-World War II, the Europeans' guilt about their Jewish problem, as they used to call it, and the fact that the Back to Zion movement was getting ever more aggressive and getting involved in terrorist activities. Basically, the Europeans, largely the British, but also the French, basically say, hey, fine, you guys. What we're going to do is we're going to set up the countries in the Middle East as new independent countries. We're not going to control them anymore. They're not going to be colonies. In that situation, feel free to move back to these areas. Now, of course, what the British aren't doing is they aren't saying, we don't know how we're going to take over property because there's people already living in all that property. So what happens is the Jewish population is encouraged to move. The British sort of fight it at the same time they're supporting it. Very quickly, this gained steam, and all the countries in Europe pretty much see this. Oh, good. This is a real easy way to remove a lot of what we see as the tension that's going to generate another war in Europe pretty soon. Get the Jews out. So what you do is you move large parts of the Jewish, or encourage the Jewish population to move to the Middle East. The group that was over there, obviously they're taking over property that has people living in it. So very quickly this turns into violence. With terrorist activities, very quickly escalates to war. And out of this becomes the state Israel. So the state of Israel comes about by populations who identify by the religious base, i.e. Judaism, moving into the Middle East and basically taking over part of the Middle East at gunpoint. And not surprisingly, the populations that are already living there are a little pissed off because as far as they're concerned, it's their property. Just because you share a particular religion, which isn't even a big religion there at the time, why should you take over someone else's house? And so in that context, what happens is that ends up being the various wars that define the state of Israel and its relationships with its neighbors. Now, out of that, one of the saddest aspects, of course, is the population that originally lived in there who isn't Jewish. And so the population of that area that becomes Israel, who are from that area, I mean, they're Arabic, guess what? That's that area. You know, they're the original population. They are, ironically, the indigenous population. They're almost entirely Islamic. They get dispossessed. And the attitude of the Jews is pretty much, you can stay as long as you don't cause any trouble, but if we think you're going to cause any trouble and we'll define what that is, then get your ass out of here and go find somewhere like Jordan or someplace else to go live, because this isn't your country anymore. It's now a Jewish country. And that's Israel, and that's the relationship that Israel has with Egypt and Jordan, the countries around it, but it's also the relationship that Israel has with the Palestinians. The Palestinians are the folks that lived in what's now Israel before the Jews showed up at the end of World War II. And that's why it's an almost intractable problem. The vast majority of Palestinians live in refugee camps, whether it be in Gaza, whether it be in Lebanon, whatever. And, you know, this is that whole West Bank, East Bank thing of the city of Jerusalem. Various peace accords have been done. If you're Palestinian, none of the peace accords make any sense because your country's gone, because it's now Israel. If you're Jewish, you can't trust these guys because they fought against you in, you know, War 1 through 6 or whatever it is, and therefore they should just get up and leave. But their attitude is, well, I can't leave because home's where you got your house now. This is a absolute nightmare. It was generated in large part by the Europeans, who just thought, oh, this is an easy way to get rid of the problem in their backyard. You just shift it down the street to someone else's problem. And of course, now it's come back to roost in a whole mess of ways. So it's important to remember that the population of the state of Israel, huge majority of them are actually still are basically, you know, migrants. A large part of the population that's moved into Israel in the last 40 years is from Russia, because Russia had one of the larger Jewish populations, but under, well, not so much under the Soviet Union. Under the Soviet Union, they didn't like them, but especially ironically under Russia. Think of that Wolves video that you watched. What you find is that the current existing Russian population has become very good at blaming Jews for everything. So very much like, you know, the Nazi Germans did in the 1930s. You know, if it rains or something wrong happens, then you blame the Jews. And so the paranoia of the Jews legitimately and in Russia is get the hell out. So a large part of your population in Israel is new migrants from somewhere else who share the common religion. And this is why you end up with a very large fundamentalist Jewish population in Israel, many of them recent. So you have to remember, they're not necessarily folks that speak Hebraic, or they're going to speak Russian or German or whatever language they originally grew up with. They share a common religious foundation, but even then there's different variations on Judaism. It's not a single monolithic religion. And so in this context, that's the mess that you see that's a large part of the Middle East. And of course, what you also have then is your Jewish population has very little tolerance of your Islamic population, because of course they see themselves in direct competition for place, space, bodies, etc. And of course, your basic fundamentalism concept of Islam is that one, the most holy city is Mecca in Saudi Arabia. But the second holiest city is where, of course, the Bible took place, and that's Jerusalem. So these two sort of antithetical religions share the same holy location as one of the centers of their sort of universe. And that, of course, does not lead to warm and fuzzy social relationships. And this gets into a basic thing I sort of want to cover real quickly. And that is that when you're looking at fundamentalism, there's a real tendency, especially in the United States, to fundamentalism as something that Muslims do. Fundamentalism is not a part of Islam. Islam is a large, complicated world religion with millions of followers, and some of them are fundamentalists. But there's also fundamentalist Christians. A lot of violence in the last 40 years in the United States is by fundamentalist sects or fundamentalist groups who are Christian in the United States. So fundamentalism, by definition, is just basically some aspect, a group within a religion that has basically subsumed or compressed that religion down to a few basic logics. So they've taken something like, say, Christianity or Islam, which is incredibly complex religions, and they've shrunk it down to a set of bullet points, so like this presentation. And you've basically done two things. One is you said, okay, as long as you follow the bullet points, you're gold. So, that's what we do. Secondly, you do not allow any tolerance for negotiation on how those bullet points are played out. So anyone you bump into who doesn't follow all the bullet points specifically the way they're laid out is not part of your group. And you have no tolerance for anyone who doesn't follow the bullet points. That's fundamentalism. Fundamentalism is basically a redacted version of a religion down to its set of what they see as basic principles. And that's how you see the whole world should operate that way. Every religion has fundamentalism. Buddhism was really big on this maybe a couple hundred years ago. You don't see it much now. And when we get into India, fundamentalist Hindi, a large part of your Hindu populations are fundamentalist. That's causing a huge source of trouble in India. Fundamentalist Islam is probably the most visible. That's certainly not the only one. Fundamentalist Christianity is actually a fairly big problem if you talk to things like Homeland Security in the United States. And fundamentalist Jewish groups, including terrorists, are a big source of problem for the state of Israel. Any religion you've got will have, some group of fundamentalists, and the bigger the religion is, the more you're going to find. In Islam, simply because it fragments itself, you don't have a central bureaucracy, you don't have a central organized, sort of mandate of what the religion is, probably lends itself more to this because you don't have a coherent sort of theological interpretation of your religious logic. So any particular individual who can be compelling as an imam can set himself up as a fundamentalist, get a congregation, and off he goes. And this is also the problem when you get in India with the Hindu religion. It's equally unorganized. And so it also has the problem of fractional groups, cause a huge amount of trouble. There's an enormous amount of violence going on in India and other areas under Hindu control, with fundamentalist groups having no tolerance of the folks around them, who you have to remember in most cases are the same religion. Most fundamentalist Muslim groups attack other Muslims. Most fundamentalist Christian groups go after other Christians. So in most cases, your religious intolerance applies more to the people who share a religious umbrella because they're not like you than folks that are totally, totally different. And that's one of the sort of sad aspects of fundamentalism. So when you see it, it's within that context. So I'll stop there.